So here we're going to look deeper into age-based modeling by looking at the impacts of measurement uncertainty on implementation processes. You may have seen this slide before where we show the case mix, processes, and outcomes of an implementation process. And here, what we're showing, as before, are the most responsive patients and least responsive patients, and the provider giving, in this case, higher effort towards the most responsive patients and less effort towards the least responsive patients. And there are different ways to do this model. It could be the other way around, where the provider gives more effort towards the least responsive patients. And here is a patient model, which we also discussed earlier. And here, the horizontal axis is the cumulative provider effort, and the vertical axis is the cumulative effects of the provider effort on the patient. And we use a very simple patient model of a straight line starting from the origin, which is the baseline, and going upwards towards this dashed horizontal line. And the dashed horizontal line represents a successful outcome. In this case, we're looking at smoking cessation. So when the line goes above that horizontal dashed line, then this patient has successfully quit smoking. In this particular plot, we see that the patient has not quite achieved the outcome. The cumulative provider effort, shown with this horizontal arrow on the bottom, has resulted in the cumulative effect on the patient shown by that circle, which is below the horizontal threshold of a successful outcome. And here, this is also a slide that you may have seen earlier, showing many patients responding to the provider at various provider efforts. And you can see cases where the patients have quit, and you can see the most responsive and least responsive patients. And in this case, the most responsive patients have received twice as much provider effort as the least responsive patients. And on the right side, we see the site level characteristics. And here on the horizontal axis is the cumulative provider effort averaged over all patients. And on the vertical axis is the quit rate at the site. And there are two curves shown here. The solid curve shows what happens when all patients get the equal effort from the provider. And the dashed line shows what happens when the provider gives twice as much effort to the most responsive patient. And the dashed line is much higher than the one when there's equal effort for all patients. And this, which we've seen before, is where we have the alternate strategy where the least responsive patients get twice as much provider effort as the most responsive patients. And at the site level, shown on the right, the curve showing the quit rate is much lower. But at the same time, we see on the left side that the least responsive patients have cumulative effects that will be helpful for future interventions. And here we see what happens when we have the same average cumulative provider effort and we have three different implementation strategies. And we can see that a strategy where there's more effort towards the most responsive patients gets the highest quit rate. And the strategy where we have more effort towards the least responsive patients gets, in this case, 0% quit rate. Now, one question that you may have had is about measurement. What was assumed in the previous slides is that the provider knew what was the cumulative effect on the patient of the provider's effort. In other words, the provider had knowledge of that straight line that represents the model of the patient. Here, what I'm showing are a series of dots that represents the provider's estimates of the cumulative effects on the patient of the provider's effort. So what this shows is that there's some uncertainty as to what is the effects on the patient. And in fact, when the provider works with each patient, the patient really has to give the provider some indication of their willingness to quit, and that indication may not be accurate for many reasons. So we show this on this plot where the straight line represents the model, which is the true but unmeasurable responsiveness of the patient to provider effort. And then we see a series of dots, which may be below or above this line. And these dots are the provider's estimates based on their interviews and their sessions with the patients. So here I show the same plot, but this time I remove that true but unmeasurable patient responsiveness curve. So what we see here are just the dots showing the data that the provider collects. But we have to remember that this is a cumulative process. And early on during the intervention, the provider doesn't see all of the dots shown here, but only the first few dots early in the intervention. So here we see what happens when the provider only sees the results of 4 sessions. So here are 4 dots representing the provider's estimates of the cumulative effects on the patient, and also a dashed line showing the provider's estimate of the responsiveness of the patient. The provider's estimates, however, will change as the provider collects more data. And we can see here that there are fluctuations in that dashed line of the estimates of patient responsiveness. So here we represent this as a feedback loop, where we have feedback coming from the data collected by the provider and going back to the provider who judges the provider's effort and the patient responsiveness. Now we return back to our curves showing the site-level quit rate in response to the cumulative provider effort. But here what we do is we repeat the analysis using the agent-based model, but this time including the uncertainties in the patient's data. And what happens when we introduce these uncertainties is that the spread between the two curves, in this case it's the curve where we have effort towards the most responsive patients versus more effort towards the least responsive patients. So what we're interested here is the difference between the two curves, representing the case where you have twice as much effort for the most responsive patients, that's the dashed curve, and the other curve where we have twice as much effort on the least responsive patients, shown by the dotted curve. And the effect of the uncertainties in the patient data is that the difference between these curves becomes reduced. In other words, the horizontal spread has become lessened due to this measurement uncertainty. So here, when we look at the various implementation strategies, we see that there is less impact on the different strategies when we introduce measurement uncertainties. In this case, you can see that the dashed line, where we have twice as much effort towards the most responsive patient, has gone downwards. And the dotted line, where we have twice as much effort towards the least responsive patients, has gone upwards, so that the spread between these lines in the vertical directions has become smaller. So this is the kind of analysis that is possible using in the agent-based modeling. In this case, we're showing the impact of measurement uncertainties on the implementation strategies.